Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. It is afternoon where I am, but morning, noon, or evening. I'm so glad that everybody is sharing their time with us. As you can tell, the pollen has gotten to me once again. But other than that, I will horsily try to get through this show. I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing intro. As always, I endorse him and support him. He is a native storyteller, and he and his wife are just amazing people. Search them out on the internet. They have a tradition that is quite remarkable. I have an amazing gentleman with us tonight. I'm really very excited about this show. His name is Gary Lachman, and he is an author and lecturer of consciousness, counterculture, and the Western esoteric tradition. His works include Dark Star Rising, Beyond the Robot, and The Secret Teachers of the Western World, as well as the one we're going to be talking about tonight. And in his spare time, he is a founding member of the rock band Blondie and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006. He's an amazing man, and the book that we're going to be talking about is his latest book. It's The Return of Holy Russia. And I learned a lot. I highly recommend this book. It's a history of how mystical and spiritual influences have shaped Russia's identity and politics and what it means for the future of world civilization. He examines Russia's spiritual history from its pagan origins and Eastern Orthodox mysticism to secret societies, Rasputin, Roerich, Blavatsky, and Dostoyevsky. And it explains the visionary writings of the spiritual philosophers of Russia's Silver Age, which greatly influenced Putin today, as well as exploring Russia's unique identity and its history of messianic politics and apocalyptic thought. I'm going to start again. And its history of messianic politics and apocalyptic thought mean for its future in the world stage. It was an amazing book. I did learn quite a bit from it, and I have to admit, it opened my eyes tremendously, because when we look at ourselves and our country and how it's evolved, we kind of assume that every country evolves in the same way, but this was not the case of Russia, where America only goes back a couple hundred years. Russia goes back more than 1,000 years. And it was fascinating to read about its people and its cultures and how their history and evolution impacted how they look upon themselves and how they look upon their country and how they look upon their place in the world. And it was so fascinating. I am so glad to have Gary with us today. Gary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely. I think that your book was amazing. I didn't expect the kind of history lesson I got, but I'm so delighted that I got it.
Well, to tell you the truth, I didn't expect to write history of Russia when I started out doing it. But once I started doing the reading about it, and I became fascinated with it, just like yourself, because I didn't know much about it. The only bit of Russian history, say, that I knew anything about around the time of the revolution, or leading up, Rasputin and all of that kind of last days of the Romanovs. And it just was fascinating. So once I started writing it, the first couple chapters are, well, I'm going to say theoretical, but that'll scare your listeners away. It's not. It's more like a character study of this type that I talk about throughout the book, called Russian Man, which is a peculiar kind of contradictory, enormous character that's able to embody sort of opposites and polarities that in the West, we wouldn't be able to do. And but then once I sort of set that stage, and then I started telling the story, it is this kind of story, and it's this sort of narrative, and I just became fascinated with it. So I was learning as I went. So with any luck, perhaps I can pass that excitement that I was feeling myself on to the reader.
Well, I caught it for sure. The history of Russia, it took from the East and it took from the West, and it combined the two. And I was so fascinated with, it portrayed the West, us, or Europe, as cultured and materialistic, and the East, of course, is spiritual, and the two influences created what is now Russia. And I never looked upon Russia as spiritual at all.
Mm.
And
well, I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, that was one of the questions I wanted to answer, is that why is it holy Russia? I knew, again, from a little bit of history that was a sort of title it had taken on in the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars. But there's a certain peculiar, character to it. So, as you're saying, that you never thought of Russia as particularly spiritual. But I guess that's probably because, our generation, I would think, knows of Russia become the Soviet Union. And that was not Russia. Many people would say that wasn't Russia. That was a Western idea that was implanted. Marxism was a Western idea. And again, that's another aim or theme of the book, was that there was this wonderful renaissance and resurgence of Russian spirituality at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. But then, and it had wonderful promise. And then that was cut short by the Bolshevik Revolution. And then you had this 70 years of the Soviet Union. And I know there's people today who don't, sadly people get born after you. And so they're born into a world that's very different than the one you were born into. And you talk about the Berlin Wall going down and things like that. They know about it in history books, but they don't, they were born after it. So it was something that wasn't, tremendous event for them. But I myself, I grew up, the Cold War was in place. And it was just absolutely incredible to realize that this enormous superpower was just gone. And then Russia's been going through this identity crisis. So that's part of the idea of the book too. It's regaining this notion, from which, and part of that, a great deal of that, is regaining this character of a kind of spiritual nation.
Well, I think if you look at, it's a terrible analogy, but it's the best one I've got. If you look at a country as though it's a cake, and the cake takes on the influence or the taste of the ingredients that are put into it. The ingredients that goes into the concept of Russia is so rich, and it's so spiritual. There's such a connection to the land and to the service to the land that in this country we don't have. I'm not saying that the United States isn't spiritual. There are parts that truly are, but the Russian people themselves are steeped in a in a religious isn't the right way, in a spiritual connection to the land.
Well, I think one of the things. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is in the States, there's from the beginning there was a separation of church and state. Sorry, I don't know if you're hearing that noise. Of some problem with my computer as I'm talking to you. There's a separation of church and state, and so it although there are I don't know what you want to say, sensibilities in the states that would not like that. They would like to have the church and the state be closer wed. From day one in Russia, that was the case. I mean, Russia came into being in the way that we see it, understand it as this peculiar nation when the indigenous sort of pagan Russians adopted Greek Orthodox Christianity, and that's always been there. That's always been there. I mean, the States, was founded by sort of, we can say sort of radical, almost fundamentalists who left England and came to the New World to set up. But there was still something very different about it too, because that was kind of a form of Protestantism which doesn't have the mystical side to it in the same way that Eastern Orthodox Church does. It has a kind of mystical character to itself, and that's another thing that informs the whole kind of Russian sensibility.
Well, and I think the other thing that your book brings out that I was not aware of is that you look at Russia and from what I have read in the history books, and my history books are old, but basically was that Russia went from your serfs and your upper class and your aristocracy to Marxism and communism and all of that, but it didn't. And what I am finding so fascinating is the see, I'm really hooked on the spirituality of it. I never gave Russia credit for spirituality or philosophy, and you had such a rich group of philosophers there that they basically put on boats and sent out of the country, which was phenomenal.
Well, this is one of the real tragic things about when the Bolshevik revolution it finally ended and the Civil War was at an end. And you have to remember that Marxism, Lenin, and Marxism, this was a Western import. I mean, according to Marxist theory, the revolution shouldn't have happened in Russia. It should have happened in Germany, which was the most highly industrialized nation in Europe, and that's where, according to theory, it should have taken place. But the problem with the serfs, the situation with the serfs, which was throughout the whole 19th century and going back to the 18th century, that was the main thing, and people were desperate for anything that would change things. And the whole 19th century was, so much of it was about what do we do about the serfs, to put it that way, because there were millions of people living at a substandard level that were, I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but sort of on the same lines as the slaves in the States. And this was something that troubled everyone for a whole century until finally Lenin basically was more ruthless than anyone else who came before him, and the time was right, and just struck because you had a lot of other things happening at the same time. You had World War I and the whole sort of Rasputin scandal. So a variety of things were happening at the same time that sort of created the proper conditions for the kind of radical takeover that Lenin affected. But it was the outcome of this long century of dealing with this problem of what do we do with these people, that are, and they love the Tsar, they're the children of the Tsar. There's this familial kind of sensibility in the Russian kind of social consciousness, where the Tsar is the little father, and the serfs are his children, and that kind of thing. And it's just there's how can we say it? There's a tremendous capacity for suffering in the Russian soul, and the serfs were the ones who were sort of the emblem of that.
Yeah, they as a people, it just I'm wondering, if Russia had remained isolated, what would it have become? I mean, would the serfs have risen up, or would the aristocracy? They killed off the Romanovs, so that was the end of it, really.
Yeah, that was the end. That was the end of the Tsar. I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, the sad thing is that there was an earlier Tsar who actually, was the one who freed the serfs, and there's one who actually made a lot of concessions and tried to, mollify things. But things moved very slowly, and it was a kind of dance where they wanted to make some concessions but not give away, too much power, and it just it was very difficult to, maintain the equilibrium that had been in place for a while past a certain point. And there were, very many, and like today, not at the same level, but there was a great surge of populist politics too. There was these great surges of the kind of the people's will. So the People's Will was the name of the one of the terrorist organizations that assassinated one of the czars. So in some ways, it was sort of like the 1960s in America. I mean, when I was growing up, or like John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, so many others being assassinated.
You speak of the Silver Age, and I've heard of Golden Age, but I've never heard of the Silver Age. What does that reflect upon?
The Silver Age is this time in Russia from about, say, 1890 until just before the Bolshevik Revolution, or maybe just before World War I, when it was this remarkable flowering of art and literature and music, but also philosophy, as you mentioned, and a resurgence of kind of religious sensibilities and mysticism. And like much of Europe at the time, and also cities in the United States, there was an occult revival. Things of a mystical, occult, magical, supernatural character were very much in vogue and informing the arts and literature and things of that sort. And this was, one of the reasons I did the book was because in 2014, I believe, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, he gave a reading list to some of his regional governors, and this was in the annual meetings of United Russia, which is the main political party there that's been in power for ages now. I mean, and Putin's just voted himself in for another, interminable, in many ways as the czars were. That's another story that runs throughout the book. But what was fascinating to me was some of the people that he had on this list were some of these philosophers from the Silver Age, and as you mentioned, the philosophy steamers. These were these steamboats that Lenin put philosophers, historians, scientists, also poets and writers and so on these steamers and exiled them out of Russia in 1922, and they were sent out to Europe. And some of them did all right, some of them didn't, some flourished. But he was getting rid of all the competition, basically. And most of those people were figures from this period called the Silver Age. So it was fascinating to me that Putin was, in the first place, it was fascinating to me that a world leader was telling his regional governors to read these philosophers. Putin himself presents himself as very bookish. He and rightly so. There's a very literary sensibility to the Russian, which I would say, I don't want to say Americans don't read, but it's not quite the same thing. There's a certain pride in, the greats, Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky and Gogol, things of that sort, and Putin himself presents himself in that way. He sort of name drops people like Dostoyevsky and so on in his speeches. And so it was interesting to me that he was having his regional governors read some of these philosophers, because I was familiar with some of them, and I found them very interesting. And some of their ideas have been influential in sort of the esoteric world, not in the mainstream Muslim intellectual tradition. And then I saw the response from the States, some of the Western critics, specifically David Brooks in the New York Times, and some others. And they were saying, oh, Putin is sort of name-checking these philosophers, and they're these kind of millenarian, sort of pan-universal Russian kind of what they call sort of messianic kind of writers about Russia. Russia has this messianic role to play in history. And yes, there's a great deal of elements of that, but it's actually a bit subtle. That's what I try to do in the book, is try to unpack what that means. But their response to it was very kind of jingoistic and like, these kind of half-baked mystical philosophers Putin's reading is trying to give his he's trying to give himself some validity, and they took that they took argument with that.
Well, I think it's amazing that he is, if they read the books, that they become enlightened to a certain degree anyhow. So, even just reading them makes a big difference. But what I found fascinating was that the Russian people seem to be very set in their ways, and it feels as though he is trying to stretch them back into, in some ways, he's trying to make them thinkers, it feels like, and because the philosophers that he put on the boat and sent away were remarkable, and
no.
And go ahead.
No. I'm just talking out loud. I'm thinking out loud, just agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. All righty. So it blew my mind away, and of course, one of the things that fascinated me with the book was, you pulled up people whose names I could relate to, like Rasputin and Roerich and Blavatsky and Dostoyevsky. I mean, Roerich is I think one of my favorite painters of all time, and he along with Blavatsky helped to found the Theosophical Society, and you think of Russia as not having a spirit, and what I found from reading the book was it was completely contrary to that. They have an amazing spirit that has been held back, held down, but it's there, and it was profound.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, as I said, during the Soviet time, all of that was repressed. I mean, it was an underground culture, and sometimes it was less repressed than others. After Stalin died, there was what they called the Khrushchev thaw. And again, I remember when I was a kid, Khrushchev, I just remember him banging his shoe on the desk at the UN, something like that. And but there was what they called the Khrushchev thaw, and so there was some things were less forbidden. There was some kind of easing up on all that, and then when Brezhnev came to power, it was the opposite. It was like everything was frozen again. And no, but there's this. That's the thing. That's what interests me now, because Russia's been going through this identity crisis, or went through an identity crisis, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the attempt at trying to adopt Western ways of free market and all that, they went into this kind of tailspin of identity crisis. They didn't know who they were and all that. And Putin seems to me he's trying to give Russian people an identity again through reviving this sensibility of Russia's spirituality that reached this peak, or this very intense time in this period, the Silver Age, just before the Bolsheviks. So he's going back to that and saying, yes, we have to recapture this. This is something that we had before. And in a sense, I mean, just as in the States, there's the whole "Make America Great Again." There's a certain kind of "Make Russia Great Again," too. But it's not only through the literature and the spirituality. There's political and geopolitical sort of ideas behind that as well. But it is sort of let us, and all of this stuff has become very, very popular again. All the stuff that was forbidden and off limits during the Soviet years is in the last 30 years or so has gone through a remarkable resurgence of popularity. So many of the writers from from this time, the Silver Age, and then others who even during the Stalin period were sort of known as mystics and all that, and who were inmates in the Gulag. I mean, there are books by them and a variety of other things. And there's more modern things too. There's something called Anastasianism, which is a new kind of nature-oriented, mystical, spiritual movement that's come out of Russia. And apparently, from what I've read about it, it's popular in the States as well. And there's new sort of native Russian, Slavic paganism and a variety of different things that have come back up. And you mentioned Blavatsky and all that. All these people you couldn't get them during the Soviet time, but you can get them in the Samizdat, these kind of mimeographed, privately circulated sorts of stuff. But then that became, available again. And so there's a wonderful renaissance of that. There's like they're having their kind of their own new age there now.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like the 60s were here. Only not quite the same. But, when I look at the United States and Russia next to one another, the United States seems to be more materialistically oriented. And I'm not saying that the United States doesn't have spiritual stuff, because it does. But what it feels like Putin is reaching for is waking people up to their spiritual background. And trying to blend it with the politics, but it's amazing. I never would have thought Russia would be where I would see someone striving to pull the two aspects closer together, and yet I think you said at some point that he was he envisions a new Eurasian civilization with Russia as the leader.
Well, yes, this is another idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, this is another idea that's at work, is this notion that, for the longest time, Russia's been sort of seen as a kind of backward cousin to the West, to Europe, trying to catch up and never quite. And there's been enormous efforts to try and modernize. I'm not saying now, but I mean in the past, so like Peter the Great, who was this great, Peter the Great, he built sort of St. Petersburg. It was something that's just designed, and it was supposed to be modern, and at that time, the 18th century. It was all based on Western ideas, and it wasn't religious, and it was all, it was like New York. It was all laid out in a kind of grid and all that. And so, and again, more recently, in the 90s, when the attempt to adopt free market and democracy and all that. So there's this dialectic in sort of modern Russian history about how Western it is. And we talked about this earlier, that actually many people have seen it as this place where the West and the East come together and create something new. And again, this is something that before the Bolshevik Revolution, this was something that was in the air around Russia, that it was going to give birth to this new kind of cultural epoch. I mean, Rudolf Steiner talks about that. I mentioned at the beginning of the book that Steiner gave a series of lectures about Russia, and a lot of the Russian intelligentsia were very interested in what he had to say, and he had this particular vision of, this coming new age, and it was supposed to be, the first signs of it were appearing in Russia at this time, and other kind of philosophers and thinkers were saying something similar. And now, again, one of the other ideas that Putin has been kind of reviving to kind of fill the gap in what it means to be Russian now, that we're not communists anymore or Marxists, is this whole idea of Eurasia, which is the kind of the mother of all continents. It's the largest landmass, and it stretches across, from Vladivostok to whatever Eastern Europe. And the idea is that Russia is a new. It's not Eurasia is a new civilization. There's one of the ideas we talk about in the book is that the West is in decline. The West has been kind of in its sunset years, as it were, and it's losing the prominence and sort of global power that it once had, and it's not the superpower it was, and that kind of thing. And now Eurasia is going to be this new civilization with its own aims and its own sort of ideals and vision and stuff like that, and this is not necessarily Western. And this is something that sets in place the kind of new Cold War which isn't about sort of economic or political ideologies, capitalism versus communism, but it's about sort of the West seems to have this anything goes kind of sensibility. It's you say it's materialism, but it's that. But it's also everything has become kind of a kind of consumer product. We sort of consume everything, whether it's things or it's sort of ideals or everything's kind of negotiable and amenable, and we can have everything we want. We can have everything the way we want it in different ways. And Putin is presenting Russia as this nation that's adhering to traditional values, sort of the traditional values of the church. And he's very strong with the resurgent Orthodox Church there. So this is one of the things that appeals in the States. Has appealed to people like Steve Bannon, where he's spoken well of Putin because Putin stands up for traditional values and not the kind of anything goes, absolute kind of hyper liberalism that the West has become kind of identified with these days, where everything is negotiable. I mean, everything is up for grabs. Your gender, your sex, whatever it is. It's like you can choose to be anything. And Putin is sort of saying, well, this is decadent and kind of materialism is spread out into everything in the West, and we have to be the last nation to hold on to these Christian sort of values and all that.
Well, it seems that during the Silver Age, it was the upper echelon of society that was into all of this. The serfs kind of didn't have much to do with any of it. So,
no, it's true. The serfs didn't get around too much. That's true. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, because they were uneducated and they didn't have an opportunity to do anything like that, and they weren't interested. I mean, they were very, very happy with the church. They believed in the church and all of that, and but
today,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So today, theoretically, there are no more serfs, right? So everybody is more or less equal.
Well, I mean, you mean there? Yeah. Well, yeah. Serfs were freed. Serfs were freed in 1861, around then. So, just like in America, the slaves were freed in whenever the Emancipation Proclamation. But I know I'm saying, but all of no, you're right. I mean, it's not that. So, how do you say it? I mean, I'm not an expert on Russia. I haven't been there. The book is based on reading and reading these philosophers and thinkers and following up, kind of the ideas that kind of prompted me to do it. But what I have read about people, some people interviewing Russians there, and they're saying, yes, we don't have, we give up some civil liberties, we don't have quite, but we have never lived as well. So as you say, I mean, I'm perhaps not right now, but the standard of living there for the average person went up, once the kind of chaos, settled, and out of that the strong man came to set order again, which is sort of traditionally what happens in Russia, and Vladimir is sort of doing that as well. He kind of pulled everything together, and so the standard of living is higher, and so I mean, you don't have that problem. I guess what you do have is the problem where it's still this tension between a sensibility in Russia where it does want to be westernized. It does want that to share in those kind of values. Not necessarily at the expense of the spirituality, but having the kind of civil liberties that are available in the West. And but again, I'm not there, I'm not on the ground, but from what I understand, it's much more free there than it has, it ever was in the past and all that. I mean, pretty much everything is available.
It seems to me that the Russian people basically really want to have a single person in charge. That's what's always.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah. Well, this is a theme that runs through the story, and this is what there's as you might expect, there's debate about that. So there's people who say, well, we've looked at Russian history and it seems this is what they tend to like. They like to have a strong authoritarian figure. It goes back to the very beginning of Russia, which the story is that the indigenous, sort of Slavic settlements there, they called in the Vikings, these Danes, to come and to rule them. Basically, we're too chaotic and messy. We're not able to stick some kind of order. We're always fighting amongst each other. So you come and rule us. You don't have to raid us anymore. You rule us. We'll take care of you. You'll live very well, and you can protect us from the other Vikings that come. And that's with Roerich. This is supposed to be the beginning. And I mean, there's a lot of debate about that, but the idea was that yes, from the very start, there was this notion that Russians need this kind of strong ruler, and you have a history of that. But there is another strain in it, which is represented by Moscow's rival city, Novgorod, which was the earliest, one of the earliest settlements, which had a more what we would call liberal or democratic. It had something along. It had a kind of council, so it wasn't this autocratic rule and things of that sort. So, I mean, that voice gets drowned out or repressed in a variety of ways in Russia today. We know about how the press is often silenced and how political opposition is dealt with as well. So that's there, but it's kind of crushed down. But the general kind of overarching kind of story is yes, the Russians love a tyrant. I mean, the main one of the main stories of that is with Ivan the Terrible, who was looking. Again, he's one of these contradictory characters because he's very interested in the arts and education and his very religious feeling and spiritual and then on pilgrimages and all that. But he also had one of the worst tempers in history and liked seeing his enemies tortured and killed his son in a fit and things of that sort. And he because I mentioned Novgorod, because he believed Novgorod had slighted him in some way. He had the city walled up and he massacred something like 40,000 people. So he was, he's rightly named Ivan the Terrible. But when he felt that he wasn't being appreciated or there was, some conflict with his courtiers and all this, he left. He just left. He marched out, and he walked out, and then the people went after him and begged him to come back. And he said he would come back, but here's the thing: he said he would come back, but only on the condition that he had even more absolute power than he had before.
Yeah.
So there was no opposition whatsoever. And this is when he initiated the oprichniki, who were the kind of first kind of secret police, who were a nation of their own within Russia, and they used to ride around on these horses dressed in black, and they had sort of dogs' heads and brooms, and the dogs' heads were supposed to symbolize them biting the enemies, and the brooms were them sweeping out, the enemies and all this kind of thing.
Well, it really seemed to me that first of all, the climate was so harsh that the people had to be harsh to live there almost. They had to be rough, I guess is maybe a better word. And that there was so much, it was the survival of the fittest. And in looking at it all, I mean, you have the different bloodlines in Europe and stuff like that was very cultured, but this is not that way. It was, unfortunately, it is survival of the fittest, and if I can kill you and there were really bloody takeovers here and there. And the bloodlines didn't seem to, they didn't seem to breed very true to, powerful people then had children that didn't want to rule, and it was not exactly a smooth transition from person to person to person, and it seems as though there was a lot of intrigue and killing and stuff like that to become the Kaiser, and so to me it was. There was no room for sophistication. Just no room for it.
Well, that came. That I guess that would come later with Peter the Great and then Catherine the Great when they were modeling themselves on Versailles, on the French court. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing is, practically everything I read about it was that the climate, the terrain was so demanding that the people who lived there themselves had to adapt to it, and they became kind of, they were able to withstand, cold temperatures and things of that sort. And one of the things I say, and I don't mean to be facetious in saying that, but as I said before, that the Russian people seem to have this tremendous capacity for suffering, and it's almost like the national pastime, because they go through, tremendous kind of eruptions of revolutions and assassinations and just collapses of everything, invasions and things of that sort. And I say that it's not so much that Russia has a history, it's that it is history, because it's like one of those old great epic films. It has everything in it, and there's a big earthquake at the end. And the other side of it, though, is this sort of somnolent, lazy, lethargic side to the Russian people, and I hope the Russians out there are getting offended by my saying this, but this is something that's in the literature itself. There's a Russian novel called Oblomov by Goncharov, and it takes the first chapter for the character just to get out of bed, and then he spends all day sitting by the stove, and so you have this kind of heaviness. And this is exemplified in all of the stories of the provincial life, outside of the urban areas, like in Gogol's Dead Souls, where this life is
it's
so
almost
boring and dull.
Yeah.
That's what it's what P.D. Uspensky, who's best known as Gurdjieff's, most eloquent expositor, but he came out of the Silver Age in Russia, and he writes about this kind of life. They call it bit. It's spelled B-Y-T, it's bit, and it's this petrified routine sort of life. And that's come down to us in sort of theater jargon for the bit actor, the bit player, who plays this kind of, the spear carrier, whatever it is, the walk-on. It's just a bit part. It means that you're not any particular kind of character. You're just filling in the cipher. And but then you have these tremendous convulsions, where it's Ivan the Terrible, or it's the what they call the time of troubles, before the Romanovs came to power, when there was this, and you say it's this turbulent changeover of power, where brother against brother and family against family. And I mean, I'm not a aficionado of it myself. I have to say I haven't watched it, but I know some people said it's sort of like Game of Thrones, something where there's this constant, Machiavellian or Byzantine, again, because it comes out of Byzantium, comes out of Constantinople. This kind of machination and planning and conniving in the background to get people out of the way and all that sort of thing.
Well, it's amazing, because you talk about, and I think this is the Silver Age, you say it was the time of the God seekers, pilgrims of the soul, and explorers of the spirit who sought the salvation of the world through art and ideas. There was a renaissance there. There certainly was, and there was a time, especially with the icons. They have definitely produced some magnificent things. And then, of course, another regime came in, and they all went, they were all destroyed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the icons, again, this was one of the things I try to bring out in the book is there's a line from Dostoyevsky in his novel The Idiot, where he says, "Beauty will save the world." Yeah. And I can sort of trace this back to the earliest beginnings of Russia's adopting Greek Orthodox Christianity, because Princess Olga from Kiev, she's already converted to Christianity, but she goes down to Constantinople, which was the second Rome. We have to remember, again, that's something in the West we're not as aware of that. There was Rome, and then Rome fell in the Dark Ages and all that. But over in the Eastern Empire, Constantinople was still, there, and it was the dominant center of power until it fell to the Turks in 1450s. But in 900 something or other, when or Princess Olga goes down to Constantinople, she's completely overwhelmed by the beauty of it. And Hagia Sophia, which is still there, which is a museum now, but it was a Christian church, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, and then it was a mosque, and now it's a museum. I was there many years ago, and it's an incredible, fantastic space. And she just was overwhelmed by the beauty, by the icons, you say, by the the candles lit and incense burning and the chanting and all that. And this is, she said, she had to bring this back to her people. And again, when it was her grandson Vladimir, who eventually he was the ruler, the Tsar, the king, and he eventually he converted, and then he forcibly made Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Christianity the national religion, sort of dethroning all the pagan gods. He had sent envoys out, they went to check out Islam, they went to check out Christianity, and they said, well, we're not going to convert to Islam because you can't drink. So we like drinking, and I'm sorry, just can't do that. And Western Christianity, it's okay, but it's kind of dull. But my God, when we went down to Constantinople, it was like some. I don't know, whatever we would consider some spectacle, that we would, see today. But I don't even think today, we're so inured to this kind of stuff that it would have the same effect on us. But if you ever, on an off chance, go to a great old church with the light shining through and incense burning and the chanting in the background, you can maybe get a feel that, yes, you're in this atmosphere of the sacred and the supernatural. And the whole idea of the icons showed the transfigured world. They weren't just works of art. They were portals. They were windows through which you could see into the transfigured world that was on its way. That was, when Jesus came. And they firmly believed in the second coming. This is the apocalyptic side to this. The history was moving towards the second coming. Jesus was going to return. The world would be transfigured. Time would be no more. Everything would be different. And instead of arguing this point, some sort of theological kind of argument, they just showed the icons, and the people were just transformed by them because they're absolutely beautiful. And I mean, one of the stories in the book is when the most well-known icon painter is Andrei Rublev, and not many of his works. I don't remember the dates exactly, 1500s, but there's a story where one of his most famous icons, which is just called Spas, which is the face of Christ, and it just means the Savior. It was about to be thrown into a fire, during the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was going to warm the comrades, and one of the workers of the world saw it and just realized it was this incredible work of art, and he saved it. But many of the works were lost. But but that was one of the things. The icons were incredible, and they have their own history going back to Egypt and sarcophagi and things of that sort, which is fascinating too. I mean, that was another thing too that I got from doing the book, is all these kind of side things. You learn a bit about where this comes from, with the difference between the East and the West Church and things like that.
Oh yeah, but can you imagine a government or a king saying, well, let's find a state religion, and actually, I think they absolutely decided against Catholicism because then the Pope was, the head of the church, and that would mean that they would have to be under the power of the Pope, and they weren't about to do that either. But what country goes out looking for a state religion? I mean, come on.
Well, again, you have to remember this is the 10th century, and it was something that would bind the people together. This is one of the reasons that you do that, and there's some sense that Vladimir I, he was trying to do that with the pagan religion, but it somehow wasn't workable. And the other side of it, of course, is that he wanted to marry into the Roman bloodline. This is the other thing. I mean, when the Russians and the Byzantines first got together, it was, the Russians invaded Constantinople and they plundered it and all that, and then they did it again, but Byzantines were ready for them, and they had this wonderful thing called Greek fire, which was this incendiary stuff that that they would hurl in catapults at the Viking ships, and it was a fire you couldn't put out. Even the water would burn. And so and then finally, just as originally, the original Slav people said, look, instead of you raiding us, why don't you live here? We'll take care of you. Constantinople said to the Vikings, okay, let's make a deal here. It's pointless you coming here, and part of this was like, okay. The Vladimir said, okay, that's fine. What I want to do is I want to marry into the royal, to the Roman bloodline here, and this is something that wasn't done. They tried to keep that pure, so it was kind of born of the purple, the royal blood sort of thing. But eventually they decided, okay, but they said, okay, in order for you to do that, you have to convert. And he said, all right. And so, after, a year or two later, he was baptized on the shores of the Black Sea in Crimea. And this is why Crimea is a very important place for contemporary Russia, for the Vladimir who's in power now, as is Kiev. This is the heart. This is where Russia came from. So it's understandable that he would want to sort of regain that, that heartland. And that's. So then that's it. So then he was baptized, brought his bride back. Kiev started building churches, started sending out emissaries. I mean, there were missionaries already, and before this. I mean, like you said, Olga had already converted, and the whole story later of the missionaries of the Russian Orthodox Church, once it got going. I mean, that's how Russia expanded. It was this kind of colonization based on the monks and them establishing monasteries to get away from the cities, to have solitude, to meditate and practice that spiritual life. They got away from the cities, went out to the wilderness, which was forest, not the desert. And they cleared the land, started a little settlement of their own. Other people came, to want to be with them, and then gradually another sort of town grew up. And then the monks who wanted solitude again moved on. And so you had this kind of, I said, this kind of religious colonization. And there's a wonderful book by an American Russian historian named James Billington, which is called The Icon and the Axe. And it's sort of how these kind of frontier monks, who they cleared the land with the axe and they set up the icon, once it was cleared. And it's incredible. And, and that's true of so many other, places as well. I mean, you could sort of see that in the States in different ways, and Mormons and so on. But, again, for me, not knowing anything about it, it was just fascinating to learn about this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but they had this amazing power, and they held their power, really by the sword, and yet it boggles my mind that for the most part they did things that were just not. I mean, because they had total power, they didn't really have advisors that could really advise them well. Like St. Petersburg, it was built on a marsh, and I mean, it doesn't make sense. Except he wanted to have his port, so that's where he built it. Yeah. I mean,
well, that was the thing. He knew that Russia needed a seaport because all the other sea access they had was frozen half the year, up in the north. So he needed a seaport, and that's what I mean. It was this was the modern world. This was the West. This wasn't an organic place like Kiev originally or Moscow. It didn't grow organically. It was built. It was decided, and sort of like Alexander the Great with Alexandria. I want a city. It's going to be like this. It's got to be here, and and both Alexander the Great and Peter the Great didn't see much of the cities named after them. They kind of laid the foundations, but they died before it was either than finished. And then it was the ones who came after, Anne, Catherine the Great. They beautified it. They imported these Italian architects, Renaissance style, florid Baroque style, and all that. And so, I mean, St. Petersburg. I mean, I'd love to go. I'd love to go to Russia. I mean, let's go to both St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev. Well, it's not Russia; it's Ukraine. But what I understand is it's absolutely fantastic. Beautiful, strange city, and it produced its own weird kind of culture too. This is kind of dream St. Petersburg, where you have Dostoyevsky, and Gogol, and these other writers and poets writing about Pushkin, writing about this strange kind of precisely because it shouldn't be. It's like Los Angeles; it shouldn't be there. It's built on a desert. There's no real water there. They have to suck the water in from somewhere else. And the opposite was in St. Petersburg. It was a marsh, and so, but what he had in mind was Amsterdam and places like that. He wanted it was everything in order, very mathematical, and clean and spare, and IKEA kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's he wanted to Westernize. And this is again this enormous effort to try and pull Russia out of the Middle Ages. Again, this is the early 1700s, but still, it's the rest of Europe has it's been through the new discoveries, Copernicus and Galileo and all that, and then you have Newton, and then over in Russia they're still back in sort of the Middle Ages, and they're not really aware of all that. And Peter the Great tried to pull that in, and how successful it was, that's part of the polarities going on in the Russian soul. They're torn between these two sort of sides. And sometimes it achieves a balance, a harmony, or that's the aim, but often it's a kind of struggle and confusion and battle.
It really feels like they haven't had the opportunity until now, till recently, to build a social structure of any sort. It was either you were the very low or the very high. And the middle ground seems to have been missing. And that transition is where culture and poetry and everything else seem to flourish. And when you take the middle section out, there's no growth. There's outrageous control and people,
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing, as you say. I think in recent times that's what's happened. There has been a kind of middle class, because, of course, I know there's lots of people that are disenfranchised and all that, just like in other parts of the world. But again, my general impression is that the standard of living as a whole has gone up, and so you do have a kind of middle class. And yeah, you're right. That's where I mean, you have you don't really have an aristocracy there anymore. I guess maybe the oligarchs or kind of the very rich, the super rich. But it's I mean, I'm not a sort of Russian expert, so I don't really know about contemporary social conditions exactly. But my impression is, I said, it's sort of better than it's been in a while, and that's why a lot of people don't mind, let's say, not having exactly the same kind of civil liberties and rights or whatever it is that, or don't mind that. Okay, yeah, we know that most of the stuff we see on television or here on the news and the newspapers is something that's controlled and fed to us by the government. But many people in the West think that's the case here anyway. I mean, I mean, God, especially now these days. I mean, in the last 10 years, or certainly in the last 4 years, the whole notion of post-truth and alternative fact and who do you believe? It's just like the lying press and all of that. It's like, well, God, who knows anymore? Who knows? So
oh gosh, yeah.
The whole notion that there's, I think the notion that there's some kind of freedom, more freedom, X kind of freedom in the West than in Russia might not really hold up under scrutiny. I don't know. I'm just saying it might not.
Well, you made one comment that I found really fascinating, is that they didn't really look to the future. They were more into the here and the now. Well,
it depends when what time you mean. I mean, there's different ideas. I mean, I said the whole Christian notion of some second coming of Christ. That was a kind of future, not like our sense of the future, the Western sense of future, which is basically based on technology and improving standards of living. Which I have to say, the way I live now, and I'm a struggling writer. I live enormously better than anybody did in the 19th century. So the standard of living is pretty high for most of us. I would say, not to say people aren't suffering. Of course they are. But
again, you have to you have to look at the weather and the land. I mean, it's harsh. The struggle for survival was profound, and
that's true.
Again, today not the same, but I would think the 1600s, 1700s, it was a harsh land to live in.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying that, and again, some people can trace back certain characteristics of, say, the Russian soul, back to things of that sort. And there's a kind of, it's paradoxical, because you have at one side of it a kind of, what should you say, a less sensitivity to kind of, I don't know, health and all that, and being worried about that kind of thing. That the West might, I'm cold, or whatever it is, that kind of thing. And at the same time, there's a tremendous sense of brotherhood. I mean, one of the distinctions is the West is me, and Russia is we. So the West has a me sensibility. What's in it for me? Everyone's an individual. Everybody's out for themselves, and according to laissez-faire, free market, if we all pursue our self-interests, in the long run, everything will work out okay. And the fundamentally, they'll be the greatest good for the greatest number and all that. And traditionally, in Russian sensibility is that, no, they think of the we, us, everyone together. So there's less sense of a unique personal identity, more of a sense of a togetherness, and which makes sense precisely because you're saying in this harsh climate, if you're by yourself shivering in a hovel somewhere, you're going to be colder than if you're huddling with some others in some other in some group. And there's this notion that the Russian philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev writes about in most of his books, and he was one of the ones that was sent off on the philosophy steamers, that Lenin sent them out on. It's this idea of what he calls sobornost. And sobornost means sort of a gathering, but it also means the church where people gather. And again, here, so the social aspect of the religion, it's a place where people gather. And there are all these kinds of stories of, I forget off the top of my head what they're called, but there were these kind of churches that people would put up in one day. They would kind of quickly put together a kind of, church out of wood or something, and then they would be able to gather in that church. So this was, again, the West just doesn't really have that sensibility. We talk about community and reaching out and, all that. That's your friends and all that kind of stuff. We talk about the community, but that, sad to say, the community is something that's important to people that are, more times than not, in a less secure economic, place in the society. And so they need the community in the way that people that are more economically secure don't need it, and they can go on their own and that kind of thing. But this is something that was, as I said before, the Russian sensibility thinks of we. And another distinction, and this comes from this German philosopher, historian named Oswald Spengler, who wrote this remarkable book called The Decline of the West, where he spells out this notion that the West is going under. He has his organic vision of history, where civilizations, they're born, they grow, they reach maturity, then they start to decline, and they die. And he thought the West is in its sunset years. But he said in the West, people look up. They look up, and he sort of pointed to the Gothic cathedrals. And it's a sense of a kind of eye, an ego that looks up into the sky and sees God up there. But the Russians look out. They look out into the horizon. And if you think about, the vast plains, the steppes, the tundra here in Siberia, there's this notion of endless horizons. And it makes sense, and that, out of that, if you're looking out, you open up your arms, you can embrace your brothers, and you're all part of this huge family and all that kind of thing. And this is why so many people felt this empathy with the plight of the serfs. And they came, as you said, mostly from middle class. Some of the ones who were really worried about the serfs were people from middle class families or the intelligentsia, who just were educated enough to recognize that something had to be done. They didn't naturally fit in that world. They had to go out of their way to go join that world. And often the serfs didn't care for them because they just thought they were these, urbanites who didn't really understand things. And so, in many ways, it was sort of like the intelligentsia wanted to save the serfs in spite of themselves. But again, it's this notion of the brotherhood, the brotherhood, everyone reaching out. And you can see this in people like Madame Blavatsky, who was very interested in the theosophical side of creating a kind of brotherhood of man.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And, you look at it today and you think, what a struggle to try to change something that is almost in your DNA, and to open those doors to a lot of the spiritual stuff. I think that was the other thing that I found fascinating, how they are really, the Russian government even today is using psychic stuff and remote viewing and things like that. And our government is too, but they won't talk about it. But Russia seems a lot more open to those kind of tools that had been developed earlier and then had been shoved down into the closet or the basement or wherever. Because, certainly... Yeah?
No, I was going to say it's true. You're right. Pretty much throughout the Soviet time, there was a lot of at different levels and at different degrees interest in parapsychology, the paranormal. One of the stories I tell is about how in the 1920s, figures in the intelligence agencies in the early Soviet Union were very interested in this notion of going to Tibet and learning sort of Buddhist methods of achieving kind of inner harmony, and this would be a way to spread the kind of inner harmony among all the comrades, and also because the people interested in this they were very saddened to see in many ways what started out as for them a kind of noble experiment and attempt, and had sort of degenerated into a kind of free for all. Because sadly, what happened in these kind of situations is, in the early ages, the early stages, you're throwing off the repressors, and then another level of oppression sets in from the revolution itself. You have the authority figures come in, and so these are real idealist Bolsheviks who wanted to incorporate some more spiritual ideas, which would be able to create a true harmony among all the comrades. And then at the same time, they believed that the Tibetans had this kind of super science, these kind of knowledge of higher powers and forces that also could be used. And one of the main literary figures, or one of the main promoters or revolutionary characters, Maxim Gorky, is kind of he's not quite, but he's sort of like a Jack London of Russia, not quite, but sort of in that same kind of real life, ballpark. But he was very interested in telepathy and mental science, and the whole idea that you could transmit. You can transmit the messages of the new regime, the new world, create the new being, the new soul that would. The whole idea, in many ways, both the West and Russia share the same idea about the human psychology: is that we're all blank slates. There's nothing in the mind that doesn't first get there through the senses. When we're born, we're completely blank. And the whole idea is, if you create the right conditions around everybody, you can make perfect citizens in some way. So at the time when Gorky, this is 1920s and all that, he was saying, okay, we can imprint this kind of message through these parapsychological methods, and very important prestigious scientists in Russia who were studying this kind of thing. And probably, you know, I mean, today it's out in the open. You know, it's not hidden in any way whatsoever. But say, the Soviet time, it was something that, you know, they kind of kept hush hush. And like you say, it's happening in the States as well.
Look at Rasputin. I mean, he did healing, distant healing, actually.
Oh yeah. Oh no. He's somebody who's, a lot of legends have grown up around him, and but yeah, no, he was a healer, natural healer. He had remarkable sort of theurgic powers, which I guess is the technical magical term for the healing powers, and he's one of these contradictory personalities. You know, he's known as the Holy Devil. You know, he was very, very religious, very spiritual. He walked hundreds of miles to go from his hometown up in Siberia down to Mount Athos in Greece, you know, to go to the monasteries there. He walked. Again, he walked. You know, that's how he got around. You know, he walked from Siberia down to the Holy Land. You know, and then back. And at the same time, he liked his drink, he liked his sex, he liked his parties and all this sort of thing. And you know, he was drawn into the world of the Romanovs through a friend of Alexandria, who's again he's the most well known, but at the same time you have all these people in the background. There's so many different figures in the background.
Oh yeah.
Pagan and Brother Philippe, and they're all different sort of Tibetan doctors, and so, you know, like today, it was similar. I mean, we think interest in sort of magic and mystical things and that sort of stuff started sometime in the 60s, but it became very, very popular then, and the most famous people in the world, like the Beatles, were into it. But it's always been around in different forms. And the Russian court was someplace where there was lots and lots of that. Freemasonry was something that was very, very important at different times in Russia as well. So. I mean, you could do a whole book on the you know, Masonic influence in Russia. I mean, I touch on it in my book and talk about some of the main characters, but you could do a whole other book just about that.
Yeah, a number of the higher echelons or the Kaisers were involved in something similar to Freemasonry, if not Freemasonry. I mean, it's amazing. It's sort of like, you know, some things will grow in certain cultures and certain environments, and some things won't. And you look at Russia, and you see that it was seeded with a lot of amazing stuff that didn't seem to flourish. It was just not the right time for it. And you know, I can see how Russia could become a place for amazing growth with the spirituality and the esoteric sciences coming in with the scientific sciences and creating a culture that is rich beyond belief.
Well, let's hope. Yeah, let's hope it's something we can all share in and benefit by. And I mean, whatever Vladimir Putin's intentions are by sort of associating himself with these philosophies from the Silver Age and all of that. And you know, I mean, that's one of the points I make in the book. At the end of the book was that I think, I mean, whatever political reasons he has for mentioning these people and telling his regional governors to read them, that shouldn't put us off from trying to understand them ourselves. And I think if we do, we'll see that they have much to offer, and they're offering to us now the same thing they offered 100 years ago, but they were, you know, it was aborted. But we need it even more now, and it is this kind of it's a way of looking at the world and engaging with the world that tries to adjust the imbalance of the West, which is, say, material, it's reductive. I mean, socially, it's about me. It's what I call the me economy. But in general kind of view of the world, that's why I say, you know, part of the subtitle is the struggle for the soul of the world. It is about the soul. I mean, what Russian philosophy had was something that the West had and it didn't want, which was the soul, the whole idea of the soul, the whole idea of you know, our inwardness, our subjectivity is not just being a little puddle of consciousness inside each of our skulls, unconnected to the world, but was actually part of the inner life, inner being of reality in the world. And it's not something you can map out in science. It's not something you can put on a grid. It's not something you can quantify, but it's something that you can feel and you can grasp and you can sort of suggest and so on and so on. And art is one of the ways of doing that. And there's a peculiar kind of philosophy that grew up in Russia. I mean, once it started going, I mean, it's not really until the late 19th century that you get like a real Russian philosophy. You have a lot of social thinkers and moralists and writers before them, but the idea of, sort of Russian doing, using sort of the terms and the concepts of Western philosophy gets going then, and it's absolutely centered on meaning. What's the meaning of life? What's our purpose for living? And you have great figures like the novelist Leo Tolstoy, who he was just considered the great novelist of the 19th century, War and Peace, Anna Karenina. But he became so obsessed with religious questions of meaning and purpose, what we would call existential questions, because the church doesn't really apply itself to them anymore. And why do I exist? What's the meaning of my life? I'm going to die. What's the point of everything? And he became so obsessed with that he rejected all of his previous art, and he went out on a kind of religious pilgrimage. And this is something that other Russian writers did as well. Nikolai Gogol, who's one of the main ones who did that. And this is something that the West didn't quite, they couldn't quite. It's so intense. I mean, one of the stories I tell is about Dostoyevsky, his novel Crime and Punishment. I mean, Dostoyevsky. I mean, you talk about Tolstoy. Tolstoy is a model of kind of Homeric objectivity and detachment compared to Dostoyevsky, who's this quivering, kind of shaking, hysterical character who's absolutely obsessed with questions of meaning and purpose and why do I exist and does God exist and is anything true and all this kind of thing. And you have people like Robert Louis Stevenson reading, Crime and Punishment and saying he couldn't finish it because it was just too intense for him. So the West didn't. I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson, he knew all about the evil of the soul. I mean, he wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so he knew all about our other half, our other shadow side. But Dostoyevsky was so intense about it that the Westerners just couldn't handle it in many ways. And this is this kind of eruption of Russian literature and spirituality and thought at the end of the 19th century that just overwhelmed the West when they knew of it.
Yeah, it really, well, it is intense, but there is such a richness and a spirit to the Russian culture that is profound, and it's there. You can see it and you can feel it in a lot of the material that I've read from that particular time frame. So that it's sad that they got rid of all their philosophers, but they and they got rid of it. Well, they got rid of the books too, but I know they're coming back and they're being reintegrated into the society. But you've got fertile territory now there for Putin, because there is a middle class. There is a group of people that are going to want to stretch beyond the restrictions that has been put on the population for so long, so that there is great potential for that growth. I'm surprised he hasn't made it required reading in the schools too, to be honest with you.
Well, he's made some things required reading in the schools. I mean, he's very again. I'm not an expert. This is just what I've gathered doing the research for the book. But I mean, he sort of put in a demand that be like one history. There's one history book. There's this history book. There's that. And so again, it's this whole thing that it's this trying to heal this identity crisis. Who are we? And again, this is something that runs throughout Russian history. This question of who are we? Who are we? As you said, there's so many things in the mix. The last thing they were these communists, but then that's collapsed. So we don't know who we are anymore. So he's trying to, understandably, give them a sense of identity, putting them in touch with, some part of their past that had been. Again, for people that were born in the late '80s, '90s, this, the Soviet era was the past. They weren't born in it, so they don't know that, immediately. They know this new Russia. And one of the interesting things is that, again, Russia this is the first time it's not an empire. Throughout all its history, in one form or another, it's been a kind of empire. It's a separatist country, which is not, it's not the same. It's not the same thing. There was Russia, but then it extended out. That's why he's interested in Ukraine and all the other areas and all that. And this Eurasian idea is an attempt to create a kind of umbrella identity that will incorporate, these lands that used to belong to the Soviet Union, and now they'll be part of this new entity that's growing up. So I've had some response from people, just online and because I'm doing talks like this and interviews and posting things about the book, and some Russian people get in touch and say, "Oh, this is fantastic," and we want to translate it and get it translated into Russian and all this sort of thing. And it's but as we said, Putin recently changed their constitution so that he can be empowered sort of indefinitely. So let's hope there's collateral benefit from that. It might not be something desirable to have someone stay in power for that long, but perhaps there might be some benefit, that can accrue on the sideline of that.
Well, at least he doesn't have to worry about being poisoned or shot. Well, any more so than normal.
I don't know. I think that's one of the things, as far as I understand it. It's like, okay, I have to find somebody who's going to take care of me once I'm out of office. And again, this is the story as I understand it. He took care of Yeltsin. They pulled him in. Again, it's one of these funny things. Because the book I did before this, which is about Trump, called Dark Star Rising, Magic and Politics in the Age of Trump, and it's about this kind of resurgence of a kind of occult politics that seemed to blow up around Trump's election and all that. But Trump was a reality TV star, for many years before he became president. Putin wasn't that, but when they were looking for a successor to Yeltsin, they actually sent, out to the Russian people a kind of questionnaire, a poll saying, what kind of person would you like to be the next president? And I've never seen it. I've never seen it, but apparently there was a very popular TV show in Russia in the 70s. I think seven something of spring. I can't remember the title right now. But it was about a Russian secret agent during World War II, who was stationed in Germany. And apparently the character in that TV show got the most votes from the population about, the person they would like to be president, like somebody like him. And Putin himself, he was in the KGB. So they were looking at all these different people and said, oh, he kind of fits that bill. And so he was groomed, to take over. And he took a short break when, he dropped out and he was prime minister for a while, not president. But, again, as far as I understand from some conversations and correspondence I've had with people that are more politically savvy than I, this kind of situation is not too different, I would say, maybe from a mafia kind of situation where, the Don wants to kind of retire, but he has to set up somebody who'll take care of him. Because you make enemies along the way, right? Whether you want to or not.
Oh, yeah. So, well, he's envisioning a civilization that is Eurasian, which implies a country that would incorporate Europe and Asia. Is this working towards a new world order?
Well, at least a new civilization growing up. Again, it's this idea that civilizations are organic. They're born, they grow, they reach a maturity, they ripen, and then they decay and die. And the West has been on its way out for the last century. I mean, it's 20th century was the American century. It's not sort of the American century anymore. Even just Trump saying America first now. We're pulling back from being the policeman of the world, kind of thing. So this is this idea that Eurasia is going to rise up in the 21st century. It's going to, and again, it's breaking away from. I mean, one of the, how should you say it? One of the ideas informing Putin is this notion that, the West believes it's triumphed. It's the end of history because free market, laissez-faire economics and democracy and other Western goods have spread throughout the whole planet. And there's no question that Western liberalism is the best or the optimum kind of political and social vision of things. And what Putin's saying is no, it's not. There's another vision of things. This is this notion of traditional values. And, it's not Western liberal. It's not democratic. It's authoritarian. It's hierarchical. You don't have, this very flexible sort of idea about, gender roles or, roles of the sexes and things like that. So it's from a contemporary Western point of view, a great deal of Putin's point of view about traditional values seem very repressive. Women stay at home and they're pregnant, and all that kind of thing. But it's like in the West, from their perspective, it's just turned into this mess with everybody just pursuing what they want. All these different pressure groups, special interest groups, competing, trying to get ahead of all the other ones, jockeying for position and promoting different agendas. And he's saying this is the fracturing, this is the kind of decay of the West now. It's breaking up into all these kinds of things. Because liberalism has finally reached its end. It's because there's nothing left to liberate anyone from. Everyone's liberated from everything.
There's something to be said for that too.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying this is how I understand this sensibility, and what in opposition to that is the notion of here's traditional values, the family, traditional gender roles, father, mother, all of that, and we know that Putin isn't particularly fond of the LBGT world and all that kind of thing, and it's not something that's and feminism and all the sorts of things that in the progressive West we're really concerned about, and seem to have taken prominence over everything else. And you can say this is one of the reasons why a lot of people flock to Trump in the States, because they didn't feel like the progressive sensibilities were speaking to them anymore. They were all involved in these very unique niche kind of groups, and they didn't talk to the traditional blue collar worker anymore. And Trump seemed to be talking to that. So, in a different way, in Russia, this seems to be what Putin's doing. He's promoting that kind of sensibility in opposition to a West that is just, for him, it's just turned into anything goes.
Well, I would say that in the West here that we are fragmented tremendously, and Russia is not, and there is greater strength with the way Russia is going at this point in time. And please, don't. I'm not gonna suddenly move to Russia.
I mean, you sound very pro-Russian there.
I am, because it's your fault. Because
that's good.
I never really understood where Russia was coming from. The people, forget the government. I never understood where the people were coming from. And when you understand where the people are coming from, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is that in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a kind of cultural exchange program between the Esalen Institute in California. This is famous alternative, kind of counterculture place on the Big Sur coastline. It goes back to the 1960s. But they were running this kind of cultural exchange thing with Russia, and there's something called Skylink, which at one point, it's, again, the Cold War was still going on. This is just on the cusp before perestroika and so on. They did a kind of satellite link with without the governments involved, with private citizens, California and I guess Moscow. I'm not sure exactly where. But they were able to communicate that way, and they were very interested in the people, Michael Murphy and others who were some of the founders of Esalen and running the thing. They made trips to Russia, and they said they met all these people there. They're interested in the same things we're interested in. They're interested in mysticism, meditation, yoga, all this kind of stuff, and actually they have this whole culture behind them of these kind of these kind of practices, which were, frowned upon in the West, and, they became popular in the 60s. But these sorts of things go back in these people's culture for a long ways. And there's a saying, if you scratch a Russian, you'll find a mystic. So, yeah, I mean, that's there. And again, I didn't set out wanting to do this. I just became fascinated with it. But I'd be very happy if people read the book and they said, you know what, I didn't know anything about this. This has changed my view of this, or even I didn't even have a view of it, but now I do, and I'd like to know more. I mean, you might not be able to go there. Who knows when we'll be able to travel? But you can certainly try and read some of the people and get a different idea. Because I mean, again, we grew up at a certain time and certain sensibilities, and Russia for me when I was a kid was just the commissar, over in Moscow, and the Ruskies and all the spy films, and James Bond was fighting them and things like that. And later on, I discovered, this whole other world there, that I didn't know anything about.
Well, yeah, that's where I came from. I mean, it was like, first of all, I loved the history part of it. I mean, every time you turned around, they were being, overwhelmed by somebody else, and their philosophies were being poured on top of them. And it's kind of like, what religion are we today, or what do we believe in today? And now you've got people who have been and are educated and can think. And, originally the serfs weren't thinking. They were just trying to survive. So.
Well, yeah. Well, I think you're right. No, I mean, again, it's sort of the thing. They were completely. They didn't have any kind of access to anything like that. They had no idea of any kind of world beyond sort of the limits of the farm they worked on, or the village they lived in.
Well, and even when they were set free, or or sort of set free, they didn't like it, nor did the landowners. I mean, they were very unhappy with being given that freedom. It was not something they asked for, actually.
Well, again, this is something that's supposed to be part of the Russian soul. I mean, they're if they have freedom, they kind of either they go crazy with it, or they don't know what to do with it, and they need something to give them order. And this is one of the these are. I mean, if you know Russian literature, these are themes that are worked out in different ways. I mean, Dostoyevsky's masterpiece, the last novel, The Brothers Karamazov, is about dissecting the Russian soul, and there's three different brothers that represent, well, fundamentally the body, the intellect, and the emotions, or the soul, and it's how they deal with life in different ways, and these are all parts of the real Russian soul. Has all of those things, and I said sometimes they reach a incredible harmony and balance, and there's some magic that happens then, and then there's times when they're just at war and they're fighting. This I mean, again, I keep going back to Dostoyevsky, but he's like the most intense, sensitive antennae of this sort of thing, and he's just incredibly sensitive to these struggles and all that. And the idea from a lot of people, as I said, Steiner and others, somebody else I talk about in the book, in the early part of the book, is the German novelist Hermann Hesse. who I don't know how much he's read these days, but again, when I was a teenager in the early 70s, I was part of this huge Hesse phenomena where his novels, Sid Arthur and Steppenwolf, read by everybody. But he talks about this character called Russian Man, and as said, it's this incredibly capacious soul that's able to hold in itself all these warring kind of opposites, and that enabled it to that kind of uncertainty, the kind of turmoil that was held in the Russian soul was dangerous. The West was afraid of it, rightly so. At the same time, for Hesse, it held the promise of something new. Something could come out of that. And will something come out of Russia today? I don't know. I mean, I don't know in that way. It's like things are much more politicized, I would say, today than they were at the time when Hesse was writing about this, or Steiner is giving his lectures about the Russian soul. Again, this is the early 20th century. Not to say it wasn't politicized then, but it was sort of couched in a more cultural kind of thing. So I don't know about today. I mean, I suspect there's a lot of turmoil and uncertainty in Russians themselves there. Perhaps they're living under better standard living conditions than they had been early in their history, but I'm sure they're faced with the same kind of existential crises that their ancestors were faced with.
Absolutely. I was looking at the array of books that you've written, and it's eclectic to say the very least. And what was it that drew you to this topic?
Well, I mean, I came to write this book because the previous book I wrote, Dark Star Rising, which mostly about this kind of, it was about this occult politics that seemed to be gathering around Trump. And then some of the figures involved in that were involved in Russia as well. So I have a chapter in that book about, it was about things happening in Russia mostly, and the rise of this Eurasian idea, and also what Russia was like under Putin's PR man, a guy named Vladimir Putin. And I said before that most Russians they know that the government controls the information they get. So what's on TV, what's in the news, and so on, is kind of made for it. And Surkov was at the helm of that for a good decade. And if we think about Trump as being a kind of reality TV president, Putin had a whole television station, had a whole studio based on that. And this fellow Surkov was kind of creating reality for the Russian people. And it was what he called managed democracy. And the notion was to give the appearance of democracy while still having an authoritarian control. So to give an example of something Surkov would do is that he would broadcast these kind of political debates, and he would have figures voicing criticisms about the government and Putin and all that. But these are all kind of invented political parties. They didn't really exist. It made for good television. It looked like a really heated debate, but at the end of the day, it was all scripted. It wasn't a real debate about between real political parties. It was a kind of show, but it gave the appearance of that. And many other things were like that. And so, and in the midst of that, one of the characters who, because from what I read, I mean, Russian television, you think about the things, I don't know in the States, but here, the stuff you see on TV here, my God, anything to entertain, but there it seemed to be they just went over the top. There was a fellow named Peter Pomerantsov who was a journalist, so he worked in media in Russia, and there's a book called something like Everything is Possible, Nothing is True, or something along those lines. And basically, they were giving carte blanche, saying, just invent anything you want, come up with just as long as it's entertaining, and they were just able to do incredible kinds of things. But it was in a certain kind of control. There were certain limits, there were boundaries, but within those boundaries, you could do whatever you want. And so this was this strange virtual reality world that many Russian people, but I suspect it's still the case to a great degree, we're living in. And one of the figures that emerged in this was this strange guy named Alexander Dugin, who is one of the weirdest trajectories in modern politics. He started out in the 1980s as a kind of anti-Soviet punk. He got arrested for singing an anti-Soviet song, at a party. But now, I don't know if it's still the case, but not too long ago, if he's not still doing it, he was lecturing on geopolitics to the general staff of the Kremlin. So he went from being like out on the fringe, strange, radical character, and through a series of strange political quick change, artist routines where he adopted different political stances at different times. He's become this kind of weird mainstream figure. I mean, he's out there. He's got very radical ideas. He's a big proponent of the Eurasian idea, and he's a big proponent of the notion that there has to be some final knockdown, drag out battle between the East and the West. What he calls the Eurasianists and the Atlanticists. The Atlanticists are all the seafaring, mercantile nations. So that would be, the forces of the West behind globalization, wanting to turn the world into a global marketplace and all that, if it isn't that already. And so he sees this final battle, and some of his ideas have informed certainly some of the stuff that Putin was up to in Ukraine and Crimea back, in 2013 and 14. Some of his, this guy Dugin's ideas about the Eurasia informed, Putin's excursions into Ukraine and Crimea. And the reason he's in the book is also because he's a figure associated with the alt-right. They're not in the news as much anymore, but if you remember back around Trump's election, Richard Spencer and the alt-right, there was this kind of new conservative, highly conservative, far-right counterculture that was growing up around Trump and all that, and they claimed to have helped Trump get elected, and Steve Bannon was, sort of advocate of theirs, and so on. And so Dugin is one of these characters that's part of that posse, as it were. And so I'd written that, and I thought there's just a lot more there. And so I had an idea for a follow-up to the Trump book based on this. And then, as I said, when I heard all the stuff about Putin making these reading suggestions to his regional governors about these philosophers from the Silver Age, who I knew, these books I read, I thought that's fascinating. And so, okay, originally I was going to do a book about Eurasia, and the joke I tell is the original title was Eurasia Dawn, but I thought that sounded too much like the name of a exotic dancer. So I changed it to, this whole notion of Holy Russia. So, there's obviously the stuff about Eurasia in the book, but it sort of shifted more to, why is Russia holy? And why is Putin interested in regaining this notion of Holy Russia? And what does that mean for us today? Because again, what I would hate to happen is people to ignore the ideas of some of these philosophers from the Silver Age because Putin is reading them, because whether he's reading them or not, they're worth knowing about. And I think they're very important, for us today. They deal with the imbalance that the West has been suffering from for many years now. We're hypertrophied in our intellect and scientific detachment, and from the world, and just increasingly losing any kind of sense of any inwardness and soul of things and all that. In a variety of ways, whether it's our abusive nature and rampant overuse of natural resources, or turning that kind of sensibility on ourselves. We increasingly. Of course, there's a whole subculture of people that are pursuing it in all the ways, in different ways. But in general, we look to science for the answers. We don't look to philosophers. We don't look to poets. We certainly don't look to religious mystics for any kind of answers to who we are and what we're supposed to do in this world. But now we're faced with, a variety of global crises, which many of which are born out of the kind of basically the metaphysics the West has been working under for the last few centuries, which is one that has excluded any kind of inwardness to the world itself. It's excluded any kind of soul to the world, the planet Earth itself. And among other things, this is something that these Russian thinkers in the Silver Age did believe in. and did feel that there was a way to, we didn't have to give up necessarily all of the progress that, we created through science, but at the same time, we do need to be able to regain this notion of the world having a kind of soul. And again, this is 100 years ago, so this is before all of our concern about climate change and all that kind of thing. And then here we are today, facing crises even worse than those that were confronting us 100 years ago. So we need. I'm not saying these people have all the answers, but they certainly have something that can help us look towards one.
Well, I mean, there's value in every culture. There's value in every country. And there are philosophers all over the place. And it adds a great richness to the culture if people are aware of it and listen to it. I mean, it makes you open yourself up more to another level of consciousness that's out there. And it is important for all of us to stretch into that area or aspect of our consciousnesses as well. And it feels as though at least Putin's trying to get it into the, all right, to the leaders. I mean, but even in our schools today, our colleges, they don't go into this kind of philosophy. It's negated.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, this one of the things I say towards the end of the book is that what Russia had to offer the West 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, with the Silver Age thinkers, was something that the West had itself, but it rejected. And this was this kind of sensibility that rose up in the time after the Enlightenment, which we know is the Romantic movement. The Enlightenment, set the foundation for science today. I don't have to go into any great detail to, recount all of the good things that have come to us through that. I mean, we're able to have this conversation now because of that, and so many other things. Of course, without doubt, we've benefited amazingly from the rise of science and all that. But it excluded some things. It excluded some things that are very important for our well-being, not only physical well-being, but our spiritual well-being, our psychical well-being, our wholeness. And this was something that the Romantic movement, different philosophers from that time, they recognized were very important. In the West, were people like the English poet William Blake, or in Germany, the German poet, who was also a scientist and a statesman, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and many others. And again, this is something. Why exactly the Russian soul was very keyed into this, it's difficult to say, but they were very sensitive to this, and they picked this up. And again, it has something to do with the notion of, the we rather than the me or the I, something to do with the whole notion of the propensity for mystical kind of inwardness and experience from the religion that they adopted. But these are the questions that obsess them. And likewise today, I mean, we've treated the planet as if it just was raw material there for us to do with what we want, even though from many sources we know, either from ancient cultures or indigenous ones today, they have a different approach to it, and they recognize there's, for the sake of a better word, a kind of inwardness or a soul, to the planet itself. And if you don't take that into account, the consequences can be, not particularly salubrious, and we seem to be experiencing that today in different ways. And again, I'm not saying that these philosophers from the Russian Silver Age can solve all our problems, but they were addressing limitations and drawbacks in the Western way of seeing the world at a time, when the problems we face today were just sort of in their germinal stage. They were addressing these sort of problems. They saw these things on their way, put it that way. They saw them on their way. If you continue along this line, these sorts of things are going to happen. And then that was aborted by the Bolsheviks. And now 100 years later, the kinds of things they were saying you need to watch out for are actually happening. So,
yeah.
I just think, again, I'm not saying they have the answers, but they were working towards something. They were working to try and rectify the imbalance. And I say in the book, I allude to an earlier book of mine called The Secret Teachers of the Western World, where in that book I spell out, well, the imbalance has a lot to do with just the differentiation between the two sides of our brain, the left and right brain. I mean, to put things very simply, we've become a more and more left brain dominant kind of culture and society. This is something that Ian McGilchrist wrote about, who is a neuroscientist, in his wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary, about he sort of reboots the whole left brain, right brain story. And all that, we need all that. We don't want to jettison that, but without the other side, which gives us a sense of a kind of immediate, intuitive participation in the world, where we don't see it as just this objective stuff out there that we can do whatever we want with, that we're disengaged from. We wind up in this sort of situation where we are today, with climate change and, even the corona, virus, in the sense that the way animals and livestock are treated and that kind of thing. They're subjected to conditions that lead to the kind of diseases and things like that eventually come home to roost in us.
Yeah, unfortunately. I think the most important thing that you bring out is that the side, and it's not religion as much as it's spiritual. The spirituality, the soul, the link to a creator, more important in my mind than an organized religion. And you can't. There's no sort of, if you say a church of spirituality, that you put in a box, so you can't do that. But spirituality goes with every religion, and it should go with government as well. I mean, it's a part of us, and it seems to me that the seeking of the meaning of life and the journey through this lifetime and all of that stuff is something that makes you a richer person in many ways, and it hasn't been in any way nurtured in today's society here. And if what they're doing in Russia is getting them more and more into that, it's okay to think about this stuff, it's okay to theorize about it, it's okay to stretch yourself, that means that they're giving themselves a better balance as far as being human beings and a member of the human race than we have here.
Well, I guess that's the idea. That's what they're saying, and I hope that's the case. But in any way, we can try and strive for that. And one way of doing that, I think, is making ourselves aware of the ideas that these people from the Silver Age, that the Russians now are reclaiming. We can be aware of that too. I mean, they're very deep philosophers. And they're dealing with wide issues that deal both with the outer and the inner world. It's the inwardness. I think for me, inward spirituality, inwardness. I mean, these kinds of things. This notion of this interior world that all of our values and sense of meaning and all of that come from. I mean, this is the sort of thing that hasn't been, given its due in the West at all. In fact, it's the opposite. Sadly, this is, how should we say it, one of some of the collateral damage that's come from the success of the Western scientific approach in terms of raising the standard of living, basically, being able to deal with and manipulate the outer world, is that the inner world is dried up. And this is the thing that I said, whatever Putin's trying to make with this, okay, but let us not be put off by trying to understand, what these writers have to tell us just because Putin may be reading them. I hope he's reading them for the right reasons. I don't know. I mean, I kind of drifted into writing about politics. I'm not really politically interested. I drifted into writing about it in my book on Trump because of this notion of this occult, kind of esoteric, new thought philosophy behind Trump. Trump is a follower of positive thinking and so on and so on. And so from that I got into this. But I think, we're at this. I mean, again, it's interesting to me because this is 2020. I was writing the book in 2019. It's 100 years from some of the things I talk about in the book. So it seems like, okay, we're 100 years on from now. And I don't think we in the West have got any nearer to solving this problem. And in fact, things have got worse. So maybe these guys can help us. They can give us some sensibility. And, so much of it is about recognizing not only our own inwardness and our only spirituality, but the spirit of the world, the inwardness of the planet, which indigenous people and ancient peoples we're in tune with more than we are. Our success as a species, our success, in the outer world depended upon our ignoring that. But okay, the way I see it, very in a simple way of saying it, it was necessary for us to ignore this inwardness of the world in order to, achieve the kind of success technologically that we enjoy today. But we've come to a point where we need to say, okay, let's put that on hold for right now, and let's go back and try to understand the inwardness, because the success of the one is starting to, impinge and act, negatively on this other. And
there's no balance.
Well, what do you want to say? It was said years ago. What profits a man to gain the world and lose his soul? That's the same thing. What profits a civilization to gain the world and lose its soul? We're able to do these remarkable things, but we don't know why we're doing them anymore. And the most important things in so many people's lives is whether they can go out to the big sales on Black Friday and things like that. That can't be what we're living for. We have to live for something other than that. So, but if you read this book and it leads you on to reading some of the people I talk about in it, then by all means that's good. Because any road to the soul is a good one.
Yes, and if it makes you think, all the better, and question, absolutely. The book is fabulous, and for those of you that didn't hear the title before, it's The Return of Holy Russia: Apocalyptic History, Mystical Awakening, and the Struggle for the Soul of the World. Great title, and it's a fascinating read. You're going to learn a lot more than you can ever imagine from it, and it'll make you think a little bit more. Gary, I just noticed the time, and we are out of it. I want to thank you so much. You can be gotten at garylachman.co.uk, and I want to thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, you as well, and thank you so much for having me on.
It was my pleasure, absolutely my pleasure. And it was a joy to read your book, and I'm going to read it again at my leisure so that I can really get more out of it, too.
That's what we want to hear.
Book.
It is.
But it's worth it to read it slowly, and not just charge through it. But I do thank you so much, and I look forward to reading some more of your books and getting you back on again at a later date.
Well, thank you. I look forward to that too.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. I so appreciate your sharing your time with us. Mark Eddy has a great show tomorrow, so please tune in and check this out on YouTube. And if you enjoy what you're listening to, please subscribe to the station. We really would love to have your support. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.